I'll start off with an apology to those that have to listen to this that don't want to. This was done for my grandchildren. I'm Al Newman. I was born in December 30th, 1914. My dad run the Lone Star Wagon Yard in Ballinger, and that's where I was born. I had two brothers and three sisters, all older than I. I don't think we lived there very long before we went back to Rossville, which was always considered home, since the old folks had lived there and had lived there for many years. My grandpa, on my father's side, moved there in 1883, and he raised up a family of 5 boys and 2 girls. 6 boys and 2 girls, I'm sorry. And there was 7 in the family. My dad and the other 6 brothers and 2 sisters. And one of the reasons for moving there, they had lived in DeWitt County, and the Taylor-Sutton feud down there, it seemed that you couldn't be neutral. You was on one side or the other, or both sides was against you. So the 2 older brothers and a brother-in-law, Ellie Anderson and Ad Patterson was the brother-in-law, and they were all 3 in their early 20s at the time, and kind of involved in some of the trouble. So Grandpa moved to Rossville, and he lived there, and he died in 1902. I never saw my grandpa on the father's side, or either of my grandpas. My grandmothers, I knew both of them. They died in about 1925. My dad died in 1922, and he was 50 years old. And I was pretty small and don't remember a whole lot about him. My mother was a bandmaker, and she had a brother and 3 sisters. And she died in 1952. She was 68 years old. And I remember everybody, I guess, thinks that their mother was the best, and that's what I thought about her. I started to school in Rossville, and I went there until I went about 2 or 3 years, and then we went to San Antonio and moved there in 24. And things was a lot different. Living conditions were a lot different then than they are now. I don't guess I ever went hungry. I was never on the verge of starving, but we didn't have a big choice in what we ate. And I remember one time my brother Emmett saw some blackbirds around a tank. They were little blackbirds. And he shot into them, and he killed 28. And he picked them, cleaned them, and Mama made what called a blackbird pie. I'd heard of that, so I guess that's what it was. And we quite often ate rabbits, squirrels, anything else, just anything that was food. When we moved to San Antonio in 24, there was cars. There was quite a few cars, but there was also lots of teams, wagons. I remember from the SP Depot, which wasn't too far from our house, the American Transfer, I believe it was, that had big wagons and teams that hauled freight from the depot to various places. Also, the ice wagons and milk wagons was passing with teams hooked to them, you'd hear the horses hitting that pavement, just clippity-clop. The horses were pretty smart. The man would step off of the milk wagon with a little rack with maybe 6 quarts of milk in it. And he'd go to 2 or possibly 3 houses, and the horse would meet him at the next place. And when I was 14 or 15, I started staying. First, I was 10 when I went to Corn City with my 2 brothers to pick cotton in the fall, and then I'd come home and go to school. We went to Corn City in 24 and worked for a Mr. Webb, and then after that, we went back every year, or that is for the next year or so, and my brother Joe married one of the Webb girls, and after that, I lived with them for quite a while. And after that, and they moved from Corn City to Taft in 25, and I'd live with Joe and Mamie, my sister-in-law, or I'd stay with Mr. Webb and his boys. He had several boys, and some of them my age, and we got to be good friends, and I was pretty much at home at their house. In 1931, we lived at Skidmore. We'd moved from Taft back to Skidmore, and the Webb boy that was my age, me and him had been off all day in the rain on the creek playing on horses, and we stayed wet all day. And that night he went to bed. He had pneumonia, and I didn't know he was sick, but I was sent the next morning. I had to go to Bayside after a horse, which was about 45 miles. I went down there and got the horse, and when I got in, it was night, and he hadn't got up that day, and he died 9 days later from pneumonia. It was the 3rd time he had had it, and I lost a good buddy. But I lived with and around the Webb family for probably 10 years. And I'd be gone. I'd go off places and stay a few months or something, and always had a home if I come back by there. And times was kind of difficult then. It was hard to make a dollar. In fact, in 29, it got so rough that a lot of people just couldn't take it. The banker there in Skidmore, Gene Renard, I didn't know him personally, but I knew who he was when I saw him. He just shot himself and got it over with. And then also there was a little girl that I liked. We worked for him at times, and her daddy just decided that it was too rough for him, and so he drank carbolic acid in a Coke. And just in recent years, I talked to an old man in Dual, Texas, and was asking him about that family, and told him that I'd known them back in those days, and he said, and that the father had committed suicide, and he said, yeah, and said, I'm the one that sold him the poison. That I run a drugstore at that time, and there was a lot of others did the same thing. But then there was some of them that made it rough as it was. And at that age, you don't worry too much about that. You just think that's the way things happen. I would hate to see things get that way now, because it's a lot easier to go on doing what you're used to than to go down from a good living to go the other way. It's pretty rough. We lived around Skidmore there for a couple of years, and then my brother went back to Taft to run a dairy, and I spent quite a bit of 4 years around there. And I had went to California first. Me and my other brother went out there and worked in the apple orchards and apricot orchards for a while, and when I came back, well, I went to Taft then and stayed with my older brother Joe and worked on the dairy for off and on for 4 years. I wasn't there all the time, but I had a horse down there that I thought quite a bit of, and I was working one time in Beeville for a little while, and they sent word to me that my horse had got hooked by a bull, and so I quit and went down there, and he lived 10 days before he died. And so I just sold my saddle and kind of left out from there for a while, worked on a road job, worked in the oil field, and then shortly after that I met up with the woman that I finally married. But before I get to that, I got to go back a few years. In 1926, when school was out, that year there was a Boyd Scallon, was a Texas Ranger, and he was also a cousin by marriage. And he bought a Model T Ford and the camping equipment, and got me, or let me go with him on a trip out in West Texas. And we spent 3 months between San Antonio and Marfa, Texas. And we camped. In those days, you didn't have to get permission, I don't think. You just camped wherever you wanted to. And we stopped along the way. We stayed at Uvalde for a week or so, camped on a pretty little creek, and then we went to the ranger station in Del Rio and stayed there 3 or 4 days, 3 days maybe. There was a captain and 3 other rangers, I believe, at the time it was there. And just a vacant, or not a vacant house, but house that they had. It wasn't a house like you have furniture in here. They had a table and chairs and bed rolls and saddle and ammunition and stuff sitting around like that. But then we went on from there. We went up on Devil's River and went out on the Baker Ranch and stayed for 3 weeks, I believe. Just camped out there on Devil's River, and it was a most beautiful place, and really enjoyed our stay out there. There was Mr. Baker lived in a little house. He had gave his ranch, divided it up, and gave his boys the place, and he just kept a small acreage on the river, 80 acres, I think, and he had a little shack and lived there by himself, just him and his hunting dogs. And then we went on to Marfa, and I don't remember how long we stayed at Marfa, but during this time there was a rodeo going on, the first rodeo I had been to, and it went on for 3 days, and it happened out in the open country. They just put up some pens there and to hold the stock in, and then when they saddled them and turned them loose, they was just out among everybody then. And barbecue dinner, barbecue and beans and pickles and such was everything was free. There was no charge for any of it. So when that was over, I don't know how many days I watched it, but they met 3 young fellers that was going to Corsicana, and they was going back through San Antonio. And Boyd arranged that I ride with them back to San Antonio. So it taken us 2 days, I guess, we spent between there and San Antonio, and I had a lot of fun with those just young fellers. They was probably 20, give or take a few years. And as we went back through Del Rio, why, he had me stop at the ranger station and tell them something while I was there going back, and got to see them again. Well, I do remember this second trip as I went back by the ranger station. Captain Lindsay's daughter was over there cooking dinner for him that day. And I guess that she was a girl 17 or 18 years old, and I was a kid about 12. I thought that was the prettiest girl I ever saw. That was in 26, about July or August of 26. And then this feller that I was with, Boyd Scallon, he had stayed there at Marfa. And he went to work on a ranch, I think, after I left there, and I knew he died later. That was the last time I saw him. But he had lived. I have been back to the cemetery where he was buried in Alpine, and he had lived a little over a year after I left. He was buried there in January. And now jump back forward a little bit to where I was just before I met the wife. I had some folks that I knew down there, Upton Webb, had been out in West Texas around Belmaray and Pecos and worked on a ranch, and he came home and got me and another boy to go with him back out there and go to work. So I went back out to the Casey Ranch in 35, and the spring of 35 went out there and had a lot of fun. Then it was all new to me, but it was a big outfit. There's 400 sections, and it was a horse ranch. They had 1,100 head of cows, I believe it was rounded up, but mostly horses. They figured they had 4,000 head of horses. They couldn't tell for sure because they couldn't catch them. It was a little bit difficult. And I got in quite a bit of riding out there, sleeping on the ground, eating out of a chuck wagon. And by the way, I find that the chuck box the Casey Ranch gave the old chuck box to the museum in Pecos. And I've saw it since then, just saw a lot of the stuff that they had out there at that time. And then we're getting back to this woman. I met my wife in 36, I guess it was, fall of 36, and worked with her dad and brother and such around Beeville in the oil field. We got quite fond of each other and married in 38. And she had put up with me ever since. And we lived in Beeville at that time, and then the war came on, and I had to go over there and help settle that fuss. I didn't like no part of it. When we come back, we moved to Corpus Christi, and I worked for the same feller I had worked for in Beeville for a while. I worked in a creamery. Well, by the way, that's how I got to get married. I went to work. I got a steady job. I was getting $30 a month. And I worked 2 months, and I got to $45 a month. And that's when we got married. $45 a month. We was paying $18 a month for an apartment to live in. And the rest went for groceries, and there wasn't no other reason to have money. After I went to the war, then I come back, and this man I worked for, W.P. Kaler, had moved to Corpus Christi and started a creamery down there, and I worked there for the rest of the time until 51. We moved to Abilene. My two brothers lived in Abilene, or not in Abilene, but in Anson, north of Abilene, and so we decided we had bought a house in Corpus, and we decided to sell it and just move up here. And I'm glad we did, because I enjoyed living around them. In 58, my older brother died of leukemia, and then 3 years later, in 61, my other brother He was 8 years older than me. He died of cancer or something. So I enjoyed the 6 or 8 years that I got to live around close to him. We done a lot of coon hunting together, worked together, and I guess got along about as good as 3 brothers could. I'm sorry for the things that they had to put up with from me because I was the little brother, but maybe they understood. When we moved up here, we had a little money, and that's how we bought this place. And they helped me tear the house down and build this one back. And we enjoyed working together. They helped me a lot. I couldn't have done it without them. And while we was doing that, Belle was having to do the cooking out in the yard. But that was good experience for her. She learned a lot about that. Back in them days, we'd kill our own hog, kill a calf. And you had to put a hog up a little different then because we didn't have a deep freeze. And you'd cook the meat and put it up in a big crock, cover it with grease, with the lard, pour that over it, and various ways of trying to save it so you could have something to eat. But eating wasn't quite as big a problem as it had been back in the earlier days. But some of the things that I remember of doing back in the earlier days, back in the 31, I believe it was, I helped to make syrup, cane syrup with a mill, like you'd have a mule pulling this, going around with pulling a big long pole that turned the syrup mill, the press, and squeezing the juice out of sugar cane. And then they put that in a big vat and cooked it until it was right, and you made syrup, which you wouldn't eat now. But we did then. It was syrup. And also I've helped make soap, lye soap. And now that wouldn't be used. But when I went in the Army, I found that the government was still using lye soap just like we made. It wasn't even cut in square bars. So things have changed considerable. Now getting back to the house here we lived in, one of the reasons that I'm kind of fond of the old place, we've lived here now for 42 years. And I know what's under the house. I know what's in the top of the house because I've been there. I helped put in the electric wires. I put in the pipes. I put in the sewerage. I dug the well, not by myself. My brothers helped me. We dug the well, and the trees, there was mesquite trees all around here and between here and the river, and I moved them and planted any tree that's growing here. I planted it, and it's been interesting, and that's why that I am proud of 2 pictures that we have of this place. That for the kids in years to come to look back, this has kind of been home to them. We've lived here long enough that most of them growed up here. Our daughter was small when she came here, and then the boy never knew any other home than this. By the way, that brings up an entirely different picture. We'll start in with that now. Now, back when we first got married, we waited longer than the required 9 months, and we had us a baby girl. Prettiest girl in the world. We was proud of her, and we kept her for a long time, and we moved up here, and she grew up and went to school here, and when she was married, then we raised us a baby boy. Can you imagine? Fine kid. Had lots of fun with that old boy. I've taken him to work with me many times. But while this was all going along, we started feeding a big old football player. 2 years old. 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 And he grew up too. And he married the daughter. So we got rid of her, and then we concentrated on raising the boy. And then grandkids come along about this time. So we have had a pretty busy life. No complaints. It's been a lot of fun. I've sat right here and got to where I'm past middle age, you might say, and I don't guess I got a complaint in the world. I'm proud of every day of it. I don't know how we came to be so fortunate in this old world. We had 2 good kids. We think a lot of both of them. They are married and have their own families. We couldn't have got better in-laws. The kids even like them. Now that's really something when you got grandkids and you like them. In fact, that's why I'm doing this, is because of the grandkids. Because I'm someday going to leave, and I want them to still have to put up with hearing me talk to them. I'm about to run out of tape here, and before this is over, there's something else I want to put in. I went to work for the county back in '53, and I worked for the first commissioner about 6 months, and he had a heart attack and died. And I worked for the next commissioner 25 years. And he decided not to run no more, so I worked for the next one, 8 years. And then I retired during that time, and since then, for the next 10 years or so, I have still worked for the county, not regular, but often as I want to probably, and I've enjoyed it. I don't see how I could have had a job that pleased me anymore. It's outside and doing different kinds of work each day, and it's really been a pleasure. And then back when the boy was 17, I think, he decided to quit school. He was a dropout. He quit school for a while, and he worked with me on the road. He already knew how to run everything. He learned that when he was just big enough to, well, before he's big enough to handle the job, really. He run all the equipment, and I was proud of him for that. And then he worked about 1.5 years with me, and then he quit and got married. He didn't have to work after that. So with a little retirement and what money the government gets and what it gives us and what my wife saves, we've managed to get by. And we just sit around and have a ball, visiting, and occasionally a couple that we met a long time ago come to see us, and from Atlanta, Georgia, Pete and Dot Paget. And we have looked forward to each time they come to see us, and we're still doing that same thing. They're coming over again before long. So this has been a good old world. So I've heard it said that somebody said it, each man should have in a lifetime a good horse, a good dog, and a good woman. Not necessarily in that order, but I've had all 3, and it's been great. I've enjoyed it. I still got that good woman. I love that old girl too. A wife is like good wine. They get better with age.